The ranger went out on a routine winter patrol and accidentally found a cabin where no building should exist. What was hidden inside made him turn pale and shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching this story from. The order came in the way most unwanted assignments always did, quietly, buried in routine paperwork and slipped between other, more ordinary tasks, as if the system itself hoped no one would notice it. The closed winter sector lay along the far northern edge of the park, where the mountains folded into one another like clenched fists, and the sun touched the slopes for barely a few hours each day. Most rangers avoided it whenever possible, and those who had already worked there spoke about it with the kind of careful vagueness reserved for places that refused to be fully understood. Officially, it was simply dangerous terrain. Unofficially, it was a blank spot in the collective memory of the service, a region where too many things had gone wrong to keep a clean narrative. He read the assignment twice, letting the words settle in his mind. Temporary winter coverage. Minimal patrol history due to conditions. Heightened risk of avalanches and communication blackouts. Monitor unusual activity reports. The phrasing was bland, stripped of emotion, but he had learned long ago that such language often hid the most serious problems. He signed the form, returned it to the administrative office, and noticed the small ripple of unease that passed across the clerk's face when she saw which sector he had been given. It was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by a professional smile, but the moment stayed with him. The drive north took half a day, the road narrowing from highway to snow-packed trail until the park swallowed him entirely. Pines bent under the weight of fresh snowfall, their branches forming a tunnel of white, and the world beyond his windshield seemed to lose all color except shades of gray and blue. His breath fogged the cab despite the heater, and the cold pressed inward as if the mountains themselves were testing how much resolve he carried with him. By the time he reached the winter substation, the light was already fading, turning the valley into a bowl of shadow. The substation was little more than a reinforced cabin anchored into rock, built to survive blizzards that could bury vehicles in hours. Inside, he found a stack of archived incident reports waiting for him. The files were thick, heavy with years of history, but as he flipped through them, patterns began to emerge. Nearly all the disappearances were listed between December and February. Nearly all occurred within a narrow strip of terrain that overlapped almost perfectly with the boundaries of the closed sector. The language of the reports was eerily repetitive. Lost visibility, rapid temperature drop, search efforts suspended due to safety, body not recovered. It was not the tragedies themselves that unsettled him. Working in a national park meant accepting that nature did not negotiate, that people sometimes made fatal mistakes. What unsettled him was the sameness of it all. Different names, different ages, different supposed reasons for entering the park, yet the conclusions were always the same, as if written by a single unseen hand. In more than one file he found references to tourists who had never officially registered at any gate, people who had appeared in the closed sector without ever passing through a monitored entrance. No explanation followed those entries. They simply existed, and then they vanished. He began keeping his own journal that night. It was not part of protocol, but he had learned the value of recording the things that slipped between official lines: the weather, the exact coordinates of each patrol, the way the radio signal faltered in certain ravines but remained strong elsewhere, the uneasy quiet he felt in the closed sector, as though the land were holding its breath. He wrote until his hand cramped, then forced himself to sleep in the narrow bunk, the walls creaking softly as the wind tested the station's defenses. The following days blurred into a rhythm of preparation. He checked his climbing harness for stress fractures, replaced worn carabiners, tested the batteries on his GPS beacon, and packed medical supplies that far exceeded what a normal patrol required. He noted, almost absent-mindedly, that the inventory at the equipment shed did not quite match the records. Several lengths of high-grade rope were missing, yet the ledger showed no discrepancies. It was the sort of thing that could be explained away as clerical error, but the close sector had already taught him to distrust easy answers. When he finally stepped beyond the marked boundary, leaving the last official trail behind him, he felt a shift that had nothing to do with altitude or temperature. The forest grew denser, the paths narrower, and the landmarks less distinct. Snow swallowed tracks within minutes, erasing evidence as efficiently as a rising tide. He moved methodically, planting markers where the terrain allowed, checking his position against the map every few minutes. The closed sector did not forgive carelessness. His radio crackled sporadically, never fully dropping but never stable either, as if the mountains were sifting his words before letting them pass. Each time he tried to report his status, the signal degraded into static, forcing him to repeat himself. He logged the interference in his journal, adding another layer to the growing sense that this region did not operate by the same rules as the rest of the park. By the third day, a storm rolled in with the speed of something long anticipated. The sky darkened at noon, the clouds folding low over the peaks, and snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets. He was halfway through a patrol loop when the emergency beacon from a parked vehicle tripped the station alarm. A family sedan, found near a service road that should have been locked for the winter, its doors hanging open to the storm. The coordinates placed it disturbingly close to the heart of the closed sector. He altered his route immediately, following the faint impressions left by tires before the snow erased them. The car sat abandoned at a crooked angle, its windows frosted from the inside. There were no footprints leading back toward the road, only a set of tracks moving deeper into the forest. Whoever had left the vehicle had not turned around. As he stood there, snow collecting on his shoulders, he felt the weight of the archived reports settle into something more solid than unease. The closed sector was not merely dangerous, it was unfinished, a place where stories had been cut short and never allowed to reach their conclusions. He checked his equipment, marked the car's location, and followed the trail of footprints into the white, unaware that this first set of tracks would soon lead him beyond the boundaries of routine patrol and into a network of secrets buried deeper than any avalanche could reach. The footprints leading away from the abandoned sedan were already fading when he began to follow them, each step dissolving under the steady fall of snow as if the mountain were impatient to erase the presence of whoever had passed this way. He adjusted the straps of his pack, felt the reassuring pressure of the harness against his chest, and moved forward with the caution that had been drilled into him through years of winter service. The storm muffled the world so thoroughly that even his own breathing sounded foreign in his ears, a rhythmic rasp echoing inside layers of fabric and cold air. The trail did not wander like that of lost tourists. It cut through the forest with an unsettling certainty, weaving between boulders and over frozen streams along a route that avoided the worst drifts. Every few hundred yards he stopped to kneel, brushing away the fresh powder to expose the compressed snow beneath, measuring the depth and shape of the impressions. There were at least 4 distinct sets of boots, all moving at a consistent pace, their stride lengths too even to suggest panic. Mixed among them was another pattern, deeper, heavier, marked by a tread he recognized from high-grade tactical footwear rather than recreational hiking boots. The realization tightened something in his chest. People who entered the park illegally often came ill-equipped, desperate, or careless. These tracks told a different story. The storm intensified as he descended into a narrow valley, the walls of rock rising steeply on either side until the sky was reduced to a pale ribbon overhead. His radio crackled as he attempted to report his progress, then fell silent, the signal swallowed by the ravine. He marked the coordinates in his journal, noting the exact point where communication ceased, and continued on foot, guided by the dim outline of the tracks ahead. It was in this valley that he found the first camp. What remained of it lay scattered across a shallow depression, half buried beneath fresh snowfall. 2 tents stood with their fabric slashed open, the cuts too clean to be the work of wind or animals. He crouched beside one, lifting a torn flap to peer inside. Sleeping bags were strewn across the ground, their insulation pulled free, but the pockets had been emptied with deliberate care. There was no food, no money, no phones. Someone had stripped the camp of everything of value, leaving behind only what could not be easily carried. He moved slowly through the site, documenting each detail. A bent tent pole with a smear of dark red along its length. A backpack with its straps cut cleanly, as if removed in haste. Boot prints overlapping in chaotic patterns near the center of the camp, suggesting a brief struggle or confrontation. Yet there were no signs of predators, no claw marks, no drag trails leading away. Whatever had happened here had involved only people. At the edge of the camp, he found the wolves. They were not close enough to threaten him, standing perhaps 50 yards away on a ridge, their forms barely visible through the curtain of snow. What struck him was not their presence, but their restraint. In most circumstances, wolves drawn to a human campsite would scavenge whatever they could reach. Here, they lingered at a distance, watching, their bodies tense but hesitant, as though the ground itself warned them away. He logged the sighting, noting the unusual behavior, then returned his focus to the tracks that led out of the ruined camp. Beyond the valley, the terrain shifted again, climbing toward a line of sheer cliffs that cut across the landscape like a wall. The footprints angled toward this barrier instead of veering away, a decision that made little sense to him. The safe route would have followed the valley floor to a series of gradual switchbacks, but whoever led this group had chosen the most dangerous ascent available. He tested each step carefully as he climbed, driving his ice axe into the frozen soil, the sound of metal on rock ringing faintly in the thin air. The higher he went, the more he noticed the absence of randomness. Even where the trail became nearly vertical, the tracks maintained their disciplined spacing. These were not the movements of people lost in a storm. They were the marks of a guided procession. Near the base of the cliffs, he found another anomaly. A set of deep impressions where someone had knelt, the snow packed hard beneath the weight of their body. Nearby lay a torn glove, and its fingers stiff with ice, but no blood. It was the only piece of personal gear he had seen since leaving the camp, and its abandonment suggested a moment of vulnerability that had not been allowed to linger. He scanned the surrounding rock face and spotted faint scuffs in the ice, marks of boots forced sideways along a narrow ledge. The group had passed this way, pressed against the cliff, funneling towards something he could not yet see. The radio remained silent despite his repeated attempts to re-establish contact. Static burst briefly across the channel, then vanished, leaving him alone with the hiss of wind through stone. He began to feel as though the closed sector were folding inward around him, sealing him off from the rest of the park. He pressed on, driven by a growing certainty that turning back now would only deepen the mystery. The trail ended abruptly at the edge of an abyss. The valley dropped away beneath him, a white void that swallowed sound and depth alike. He approached the brink cautiously, peering down into the swirling snow, expecting to see the final chaotic scatter of footprints where the group had lost their footing. Instead, he found nothing of the sort. The tracks did not break or splay. They converged neatly at the cliff's edge and then vanished, as if the people who made them had simply stepped into the air. He knelt there for a long time, the storm coating his parka in a crust of ice, struggling to reconcile what he saw with any plausible explanation. He had investigated fatal falls before. There were always signs, a skid, a frantic scramble, something to indicate the moment when gravity claimed its due. Here there was only order, a quiet termination of movement that defied the chaos of the environment. It was then that he noticed the ladder. At first it was only a hint of geometry against the rock, a line too straight to belong to nature. He wiped snow from his goggles and leaned closer, his heart thudding in his ears. A narrow wooden structure clung to the cliff face, its rungs descending into the wide abyss below, partially concealed by the storm. Someone had built a bridge where none should exist. He tested the nearest rung with his gloved hand. The wood was solid, cold, but not rotten, secured with bolts that disappeared into the stone. This was not a relic left by some forgotten mountaineer. It was a maintained route, a passage meant to be used even in winter. The realization sent a ripple of unease through him that had nothing to do with the cold. As he began his descent, one careful step at a time, he could not shake the feeling that he was crossing an invisible boundary, leaving behind the last fragments of the official world he knew. The closed sector was no longer just a place where people went missing. It was a corridor, a conduit leading somewhere hidden from the maps and the minds of those tasked with protecting the park. And he was moving straight into its heart. The ladder swayed slightly beneath his weight as he descended, each rung biting into his gloves through the numbness of cold. The abyss yawned at his back, invisible yet omnipresent, a depth he felt rather than saw. Snow poured past him in slanted sheets, carried by gusts that howled against the cliff face, but the structure itself held firm, anchored into the rock with a precision that spoke of planning and repetition. Whoever had built this had not done so in a hurry, nor had they done it only once. At the bottom of the ladder, the cliff receded into a narrow ledge no wider than a man's shoulders. He edged sideways, pressing his back to the stone, following the line of scuffed rock he had seen from above. His boots found purchase where others had passed before him, their marks hidden now beneath fresh snow, but etched into his mind by the logic of the route. After several tense minutes, the ledge curved inward, sheltering him from the wind, and he caught his first glimpse of the cabin. It sat impossibly on the cliffside, and its wooden walls bolted directly into the mountain as if it had grown there. The roof was steep to shed snow, its eaves crusted with ice, and from a short metal chimney rose a thin plume of smoke that dissolved almost immediately in the storm. The sight of it stopped him in his tracks. He had spent years in the park and knew every registered structure by heart. This place was not supposed to exist. The door was a simple slab of reinforced timber, its handle worn smooth by frequent use. He listened for a long moment, straining to hear any sound from within, but the storm drowned out everything. Slowly, he pushed the door open, ready to retreat if he sensed movement inside. Instead, he was met by a rush of warm air carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and something medicinal, a sterile undertone that did not belong in a wilderness cabin. The interior was small but meticulously arranged. A cast-iron stove glowed in the corner, its fire banked low to conserve fuel. Shelves lined the walls, holding rows of canned food, bottled water, and sealed medical kits. Ropes and harnesses hung from pegs in a way that made them easy to grab in a hurry. On a narrow table lay a map of the surrounding terrain, its surface crowded with pencil marks and coded notations. The room felt less like a refuge and more like a field office, every object positioned with deliberate efficiency. He moved carefully, resisting the urge to touch anything unnecessarily, letting his eyes absorb the details. A pile of winter boots in varying sizes stood near the door, their soles caked with dried mud rather than snow, suggesting long journeys through terrain lower and warmer than this frozen perch. Nearby, he found a stack of currencies held together with rubber bands, the bills sorted by denomination and origin. He had seen this kind of cash only in the aftermath of major trafficking cases, never in the heart of a national park. Beneath the table sat a portable medical pack, its contents arranged with a precision that bordered on clinical. Antibiotics, intravenous fluids, sterile syringes, bandages rated for field surgery. This was far beyond what a lost hiker or even an experienced mountaineer would carry. Whoever used this cabin anticipated injuries, illnesses, perhaps worse, and had prepared to deal with them in isolation. A cup stood on the stove, its rim marked by a faint ring of dried tea. The fire was not just warm, it was recent. Someone had been here not long ago, tending to the stove in the midst of a storm that would have kept most people huddled in their homes. The realization sharpened his senses, heightening the awareness of his own presence as an intrusion. He scanned the room for exits and found one almost immediately. At the back of the cabin, concealed behind a rack of climbing helmets, was a narrow door reinforced with steel brackets. It led not outside, but into the mountain itself, a dark opening that breathed cold air into the warmth of the room. The architecture of the place resolved in his mind with a sudden clarity. This was not a hideaway built for solitude. It was a node, a checkpoint embedded into the rock, designed to funnel people through the closed sector with speed and control. He took out his camera and began recording, narrating quietly despite knowing the audio would be ruined by the storm. He captured the money, the medical supplies, the map. Then he noticed the floorboards near the stove. Their grain ran in a slightly different direction from the rest of the planks, a subtle variation that might have escaped him had he not been trained to see such things. He knelt and pressed down gently. One board shifted under his weight. The panel lifted to reveal a shallow cavity beneath the floor, shielded from casual inspection by the heavy table that normally covered it. Inside lay a collection of items that erased any lingering doubt about the cabin's purpose. Passports from half a dozen countries, their pages pristine despite the harsh environment. Satellite phones still sealed in plastic. Bundles of SIM cards labeled with dates. Handwritten notebooks whose spines were cracked from constant use. His pulse quickened as he realized the scope of what he was seeing. This was not the operation of a single desperate group. It was a system, refined and maintained over years, perhaps decades. He flipped open the nearest notebook and scanned its pages, his eyes catching on columns of numbers and cryptic annotations. There were dates that matched the disappearances in the park archives, quantities that aligned too closely with the number of missing persons to be coincidence. Each entry ended with a terse mark that seemed to indicate completion or failure, though the meaning of the symbols was not yet clear. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the warmth oppressive. He was no longer an observer in a strange place. He was standing in the heart of a machine that had been grinding quietly beneath the surface of the park, unseen and unchallenged. The closed sector had been a facade, a convenient explanation for tragedies that no one had wanted to examine too closely. He replaced the panel and stood, forcing himself to breathe evenly. The storm outside showed no sign of abating, and the radio at his belt remained stubbornly silent. If someone returned to this cabin while he was here, he would be trapped between the cliff and the mountain with no easy escape. Yet, leaving without documenting everything would mean abandoning the only tangible proof he had found so far. He resumed recording, capturing the hidden door, the tunnel beyond, the pattern of wear on the floor that revealed how often the panel was opened. Each detail felt like a small victory against the anonymity of the system he was uncovering. By the time he finished, the chill had begun to creep back into his bones, a reminder that the mountain still held all the power in this place. As he prepared to leave, he paused in the doorway, looking back at the cabin glowing softly against the encroaching darkness. It was a beacon in the storm, a promise of survival to those who knew how to reach it, and a death trap to those who did not. He stepped back onto the narrow ledge, beginning the careful climb toward the world he thought he understood, unaware that what he had yet to find would tie this hidden refuge to crimes far more dangerous than smuggling people through snowbound mountains. The climb back up the ladder felt longer than the descent had, not because the storm had worsened, but because the cabin now lived in his mind like a secret that refused to stay silent. Each rung seemed to echo with questions, each pull of his arms a reminder that whatever he had just seen was only the surface of something much larger. By the time he reached the ledge above, his muscles burned and his thoughts raced in a restless loop. The closed sector no longer appeared empty. It felt inhabited by intention. He did not go far before stopping again. The wind had shifted, clearing a narrow swath of snow from the cliff face, revealing a faint series of markings carved into the rock. They were small, almost childish in appearance, yet their placement was too deliberate to be dismissed as idle scratches. He traced them with his gloved fingers, noting their resemblance to the coded symbols he had glimpsed in the notebooks. It was another confirmation that the cabin was not an anomaly, but part of a wider language inscribed onto the mountain itself. When he finally reached a point where the radio signal flickered back to life, he attempted to transmit a brief status report. The response was delayed, warped by interference, and cut short before he could convey anything of substance. He recorded the failed attempt in his journal, underlining the time and location twice, then moved on, driven by the need to understand the material he had uncovered before anyone else could intervene. He returned to the substation after nightfall, his clothes stiff with ice and exhaustion pulling at his limbs. Sleep was impossible. The image of the passports beneath the floorboards replayed in his mind, each blank face staring back at him with an urgency that the official reports had never captured. He spread his notes across the narrow desk and began to piece together the fragments. The first pattern that emerged was temporal. The dates in the notebooks from the cabin corresponded almost perfectly with the disappearances listed in the park archives. Where the reports spoke vaguely of winter storms and lost hikers, the coded entries were precise, marking exact days and quantities. He overlaid the two sets of data and felt a chill more penetrating than the mountain air. People had not been lost here. They had been processed. The second pattern was geographic. The routes marked in the hidden maps converged on a cluster of coordinates that lay deeper within the closed sector, far from any recognized trail system. He had never patrolled that area before. It was a stretch of rugged terrain known for its unstable rock formations, a place avoided even in summer due to the risk of collapse. If there was another facility out there, it would be invisible to all but those who knew exactly where to look. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself, then began preparing for another journey. He selected a different pack this time, one designed for longer, more dangerous excursions, and filled it with gear he had rarely needed before. As he worked, he noticed again the discrepancies in the inventory. More rope missing. A set of heavy-duty anchors unaccounted for. The ledger entries were neat, methodical, a paper trail that had been smoothed over to the point of invisibility. Someone had anticipated scrutiny long before he ever arrived. The storm had cleared by morning, leaving the world encased in brittle silence. He set out at dawn, following the coordinates from the cabin map, moving through forests that grew increasingly distorted as he advanced. Trees leaned at odd angles, their roots exposed where the soil had been undermined by unseen forces. Snow covered everything, but beneath it he sensed a tension in the land, as though it were waiting to give way. He found the second structure near the base of a sheer rock wall, its exterior disguised beneath a layer of weathered planks and rusted signage bearing the faded emblem of the Forest Service. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a relic from a bygone era, a forgotten outpost left to rot. Up close, however, the illusion dissolved. The boards were too new, the bolts too clean. The door was reinforced with steel, its lock complex and modern. He forced the door open with the aid of a pry bar, the sound of splintering wood muffled by the surrounding snow. Inside, he was met by a smell he recognized immediately from training exercises conducted far from any wilderness, the sharp chemical tang of industrial compounds. The interior was cavernous compared to the cliffside cabin, its ceiling supported by heavy beams sunk deep into the mountain. Portable floodlights hung from hooks, illuminating a chaotic array of equipment that had no place in a protected national park. Drilling rigs stood in silent rows, their bits stained with mineral residue. Crates of reagents were stacked along one wall, each marked with hazard symbols. On a central workbench lay trays of rock samples, their surfaces glittering faintly where the light caught flecks of something valuable. He knelt beside them, examining the grain and coloration, and recognized the signature of rare earth minerals used in high-end electronics and specialized alloys. The quantity of samples suggested more than a minor operation. This was extraction on a scale that would devastate the surrounding ecosystem if left unchecked. A battered ledger sat open on the bench. Its pages were dense with figures, tracking volumes removed, projected yields, and the efficiency of each work cycle. Interspersed among the data were references to personnel, most identified only by code. Occasionally, however, a different term appeared, written in a cramped hand, always followed by a number and a date. Group. The word recurred with unsettling regularity. He flipped through the ledger, his heart sinking as the meaning became clear. These groups were not geological teams or contracted specialists. They were the same clusters of people recorded in the notebooks from the cabin, the individuals funneled through the closed sector under the guise of illegal crossings. Here, they had been put to work in conditions so hazardous that the very mountain was beginning to collapse around them. He moved deeper into the structure, drawn by a faint odor that overpowered even the chemicals. It was the unmistakable scent of decay, masked poorly by disinfectant. Following it, he emerged through a narrow passage into an alcove where the rock wall had partially given way. The snow here was different, not the pristine white he had come to associate with the park, but a dirty, compacted mass layered over debris. He knelt and brushed it aside, his hands shaking despite the thick gloves. The edge of a boot appeared, its leather cracked and discolored. Nearby, he uncovered the strap of a backpack, the fabric torn and stiff with ice. He did not need to dig further to understand what lay beneath. The oblong shapes in the snow told the rest of the story, silent witnesses to the cost of the operation hidden within these mountains. He rose slowly, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him with a force no avalanche could match. This was no longer about smugglers slipping across a border or a handful of rogue prospectors exploiting a loophole. It was a system that consumed human lives as casually as it did mineral deposits, leaving behind nothing but empty reports and a landscape scarred beyond recognition. As he stood in the shadow of the concealed facility, he became aware of another presence, not seen, but sensed in the way the forest seemed suddenly alert. Fresh footprints crossed the snow near the entrance, partially obscured but unmistakable in their direction. Someone had been here recently, perhaps even while he was inside the cabin on the cliff. The closed sector, it seemed, was no longer content to keep its secrets buried. It was beginning to close in around him, drawing him deeper into a web of crimes that reached far beyond anything he had imagined when he first accepted the assignment. The footprints he had noticed near the concealed facility refused to leave his thoughts. They were not part of the chaos left by collapsing rock or panicked workers fleeing a cave-in. They were too deliberate, pressed into the snow with the measured stride of people who knew the terrain. He circled the structure once more, forcing himself to memorize every bend of the slope, every cluster of trees that could offer cover, because instinct told him that he was no longer merely uncovering the past. He was being observed in the present. By the time he reached a safer distance, his breath had settled into a controlled rhythm, but his pulse still throbbed at his temples. He opened his journal with fingers that felt clumsy despite years of winter patrols and began to write everything he had seen inside the hidden extraction site. The words came out harsher than usual, stripped of the neutrality that had characterized his earlier entries. This place did not invite restraint. It demanded testimony. That evening, he spread the photographs from the cabin's hidden cache and the images from the drilling site across his desk at the substation. Faces stared back at him from passport photos, some of them faintly smiling, others caught in the awkward expression of bureaucratic formality. He matched the dates on the documents with the coded entries in the notebooks, then with the park's official missing persons files. The pattern was no longer subtle. The same clusters of people were being routed through the closed sector under false identities, their supposed tourist activities recorded in the park logs only after they had already vanished. He lingered over a few names that recurred in different forms. One man appeared in 3 separate passports, each time under a different nationality, his hair length altered, his expression slightly modified, yet unmistakably the same person. Another photograph showed a young woman whose eyes reminded him of someone he had once helped off a trail during a summer storm. The resemblance was enough to unsettle him, blurring the line between the abstract idea of victims and the tangible reality of individual lives. The notebooks from the cabin were merciless in their simplicity. Next to each date was a number. Sometimes the number was followed by a short mark, sometimes by a second notation written in a tighter hand. He deciphered their meaning gradually, cross-referencing with the ledgers from the drilling site. When the mark appeared alone, the group had reached the extraction point. When it was paired with the second symbol, it meant that fewer people had arrived than had departed. There was no further explanation. Loss was reduced to a typographical variation. Sleep deserted him again. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the boot protruding from the snow at the base of the collapsed alcove, the leather cracked by cold, the body beneath it left unnamed and uncounted. He thought of the wolves circling the ruined camp, keeping their distance as though they understood that the dead here were not theirs to claim. The closed sector had become a graveyard not by accident, but by design. In the morning, he ventured out once more, this time toward a ridge that overlooked a cluster of ravines he had never mapped in detail. From above, he could see how the routes from the cabin and the drilling site converged, forming a web of narrow paths invisible from the main trails. It was a geography of concealment, a landscape reshaped not by glaciers or erosion, but by human intention. He imagined people being marched through these corridors in the dead of winter, their hands numb, their thoughts fixed on whatever promise had drawn them here. By the time they realized the truth, the park itself would have been their prison. He knelt at the edge of a ravine and brushed away the top layer of snow. Beneath it lay the faded outline of fabric, barely discernible against the rock. He did not dig further, unwilling to disturb the remains without the authority and resources to recover them properly. Instead, he marked the location with his GPS and recorded a short video, his voice breaking for the first time as he described what he believed lay hidden below the surface. Returning to the substation, he noticed subtle changes in his surroundings. A truck parked near the equipment shed bore unfamiliar plates. A set of boot prints crossed the yard, heavier and more deeply imprinted than those of any ranger he knew. Inside, the radio log showed a series of routine check-ins from his supervisor that were conspicuously absent of any questions about his patrols. It was as though he were being given just enough attention to ensure his compliance, but not enough to invite scrutiny. He began to understand the durability of the system he was uncovering. It thrived on assumptions. Rangers assumed disappearances were inevitable. Supervisors assumed their subordinates were following protocol. The public assumed that the park was as safe as any wilderness could be. Within that mesh of mutual trust, a criminal enterprise had flourished, feeding on desperation and the remoteness of the mountains. That night, he compiled his evidence into a single encrypted file, compressing the photographs, coordinates, and transcribed ledger entries into a package small enough to transmit if he ever found a stable connection. He hesitated only once, his finger hovering over the save command, aware that from this point forward, ignorance would no longer be an option. He saved the file and felt the last vestiges of detachment slip away. Before dawn, he ventured back into the forest, drawn not by a specific lead but by the need to walk the ground that had borne so many unseen tragedies. As he moved through the closed sector, he no longer saw only snow and stone. He saw the outlines of stories that had never been told, footsteps that had ended abruptly, lives reduced to numbers in a ledger hidden beneath a cabin floor. The park, which he had always regarded as a sanctuary, now seemed complicit through its silence. Near the end of his patrol, he noticed something that confirmed his growing unease. Fresh marks had been carved into the trunk of a pine, the same small symbols he had seen on the cliff face near the cabin. They were positioned at eye level, bold enough to be noticed by anyone who knew to look. The message was clear even if the code was not. He was no longer the only one reading the mountain's secret language. He returned to the substation with a heightened awareness of every sound, every shadow. The broken lives he had uncovered were not confined to the past. They were the foundation upon which the present was being built, and, unless he acted, the closed sector would continue to consume people as efficiently as it consumed snow. The next step, he knew, would require him to move beyond the boundaries of the park's quiet complicity and confront the system that had allowed such suffering to remain hidden for so long. The symbols carved into the pine trunk were small, almost delicate, yet they carried more weight than any official memo he had ever received. He stood there for a long moment, the forest silent around him, trying to convince himself that it was coincidence, that someone else had passed through for reasons unrelated to his own discoveries. But the timing was too perfect, the placement too deliberate. Whoever had made those marks had wanted them to be seen, and, more importantly, had known exactly where he would be walking. From that morning onward, he no longer felt alone in the closed sector. Every broken branch, every distant crack of ice echoed with the possibility of unseen eyes. He changed his patrol patterns, doubling back on his own tracks, taking routes that no one would choose unless they were trying to disappear into the terrain. It was a tactic he had learned from search and rescue operations when the objective was to avoid being followed by curious crowds, or, in rarer cases, by people who did not want to be found. Now he was using it against something far more dangerous than hikers. At the substation, he began to notice other signs that the environment around him was shifting. The logbooks were being updated with unusual frequency, entries filled in with a precision that had been absent before his arrival. His supervisor called more often, the conversations polite but hollow, filled with questions that never quite touched the heart of his work. He answered carefully, offering nothing beyond what could be gleaned from routine patrols, while privately cataloging every discrepancy in tone or timing. It felt as though a net were tightening around him, each thread subtle enough to be dismissed on its own, yet together forming a pattern he could not ignore. He knew that if he tried to escalate the matter through normal channels, the information would be filtered, diluted, perhaps even buried. The same machinery that had allowed the trafficking routes and illegal extraction to operate undisturbed would be mobilized to protect itself. The Park Service was not a villain in the conventional sense, but it was a system built on trust, continuity, and a reluctance to expose its own fractures. Within such a system, truth could be an inconvenience rather than a priority. The encrypted file on his computer became his lifeline. Each night he added to it, compiling photographs, coordinates, transcripts of ledger entries, and his own observations into a narrative that no internal report could capture. He stored redundant copies on flash drives small enough to conceal inside the lining of his jacket, in the hollowed handle of a broken ice axe, even taped beneath the underside of his desk. If something happened to him, he wanted there to be no single point of failure. His first attempt to reach beyond the park's hierarchy came during a brief window of stable signal late one afternoon. He drove to a ridge he had mapped earlier, where the mountains opened just enough to let the radio breathe. The call was routed through a secure channel he had been given years before for unrelated emergency coordination, a number he had never expected to use again. When a voice finally answered, distorted but present, he spoke in clipped sentences, offering only the essential details, enough to convey the gravity of the situation without alerting anyone who might be listening. The response was cautious. He was asked for proof, for confirmation that this was not a misinterpretation born of stress or isolation. He transmitted a single photograph, heavily compressed, showing the passports beneath the cabin floor. The line went silent for several long seconds, then the voice returned, altered in a way that needed no interpretation. Arrangements were made, not for immediate action, but for further contact under conditions that would minimize risk to all involved. The following days unfolded with an intensity that left little room for doubt. Vehicles he did not recognize appeared on the perimeter roads, their drivers never venturing far from their engines. The equipment shed was inventoried twice within a single week, the records examined by officials he had never met. One evening, he returned from patrol to find his desk drawer slightly ajar, the contents arranged almost exactly as he had left them, save for a faint impression in the dust where his flash drive had been hidden. The drive was still there, but the message was unmistakable. He had been checked. Fear, when it finally arrived, did so not as panic but as a sharpening of perception. He began to notice the rhythm of the closed sector in a new way. The pauses between storms, the windows of silence when the mountains seemed to relax their grip on the land. These were the moments he used to move data, to upload fragments of his file in bursts too small to be detected easily, scattering the truth across channels that no single gatekeeper could control. The federal contact requested a physical meeting, a transfer of the complete archive that could not be intercepted or corrupted. The location was chosen with care, a stretch of highway outside the park's jurisdiction, a place where his presence would not be immediately flagged as unusual. The risk was enormous. Leaving the closed sector meant abandoning the terrain that had become his shield, exposing himself to scrutiny on open roads where surveillance was far easier. He prepared as though for a long expedition, though he intended to be gone only a few hours. He disguised his departure as a routine supply run, filed the appropriate paperwork, and drove away beneath a sky that threatened another storm. Every mile he put between himself and the mountains felt like a betrayal, yet he knew that staying would only lead to isolation, to the slow erosion of his capacity to act. The meeting itself was brief, almost anticlimactic. The agent who received the data did not ask for a narrative. The file spoke for itself. When their eyes met across the hood of an unmarked car, he saw in the other man's expression a reflection of his own exhaustion, the recognition that they were now bound together by something neither could undo. He drove back to the park before nightfall, the weight of the transfer settling over him like a second skin. Within days, the pressure intensified. His patrol schedule was altered without explanation, rerouted away from the areas he had mapped most thoroughly. Requests for equipment were delayed, then denied. Rumors filtered down from headquarters about procedural violations, about concerns regarding his judgment in the closed sector. It was the beginning of a familiar process, one he had seen used against colleagues who had pushed too hard against bureaucratic inertia. The difference this time was that he was prepared. He stopped using the substation's network entirely, relying instead on prearranged check-in times with his federal contact, brief windows when he could confirm that the investigation was progressing and that his evidence remained intact. He trusted no one inside the park, yet he continued his patrols with the same outward diligence as before, understanding that any visible change in behavior would only hasten his removal. The closed sector, which had once felt like a boundary, now seemed like a battleground. He walked its frozen corridors with the knowledge that the system he was challenging was vast, interconnected, and deeply invested in its own preservation. Yet he also sensed that it was not invincible. It had thrived on invisibility, on the assumption that no one would look closely enough to see the seams. He had looked. And now, whether he wished it or not, the truth was in motion, moving through channels far beyond the reach of the mountains that had hidden it for so long. The mountains did not change their face when the investigation moved beyond the park's borders, yet everything within him knew that the ground beneath his feet had shifted. The closed sector, once merely a remote stretch of winter wilderness, had become a contested space in which every routine action was charged with consequence. He felt it in the altered cadence of radio calls, in the way supply requests were routed through unfamiliar desks, in the sudden presence of new supervisors whose eyes lingered a little too long on his reports. He adapted the way a field operative adapts when the perimeter closes in. His patrols no longer began or ended in predictable loops. He would leave the substation under the pretense of checking avalanche markers and then vanish into secondary trails that no schedule accounted for. Sometimes he doubled back. Sometimes he circled wide enough to cross his own tracks, learning to read the snow not only for what it revealed, but for what it concealed. Each day he memorized fresh escape routes, mental corridors through the forest that could carry him away if pursuit ever ceased to be subtle. At night, he reorganized his evidence again and again, not because it needed further structure, but because repetition steadied his nerves. The file now existed in fragments across multiple storage devices, some hidden in the cabin on the cliff, some buried near the second structure, some carried on his person in places he doubted even a thorough search would uncover. He rehearsed the logic of it all, ensuring that if he were taken, the narrative would still coalesce elsewhere. He did not indulge in fantasies of heroism. He prepared for erasure. The first overt pressure came in the form of an internal review. He was summoned to a meeting that had not existed on the schedule the night before, his name penciled into a margin as though it had been an afterthought. The room was warmer than the substation, its walls adorned with photographs of summer trails and smiling families, a pastoral mask that clashed violently with the tension in the air. The questions were polite, procedural, each framed as a matter of concern for his well-being. Was he sleeping enough? Had the isolation affected his judgment? Did he feel supported in the closed sector? He answered in the language of the service, careful to acknowledge the hardships without conceding any flaw that could be weaponized. Yet, he could see the shape of the trap forming. The goal was not to refute his findings, but to destabilize the credibility of the man who had made them. If he could be portrayed as exhausted, obsessive, or erratic, then the evidence he had gathered would inherit those qualities by association. Leaving the meeting, he noticed a sedan idling near the maintenance yard, its engine humming too softly for the temperature. It followed him for 3 miles along a road that should have been empty, peeling away only when he turned toward a trailhead that could not accommodate vehicles. He did not look back. He no longer needed to confirm what he already knew. The federal contact began sending shorter messages, their tone more urgent. There were indications that local officials had been alerted to irregularities in the data flow, that the inquiry was meeting resistance at levels far above the park's administrative ladder. Names surfaced, then disappeared. Departments issued statements that contradicted each other within the same paragraph. It was the familiar choreography of institutions under threat, each step designed to buy time. One afternoon, as he approached the ridge where he had first regained radio signal weeks earlier, he found fresh tire tracks pressed into the snow. They did not match any vehicle assigned to the substation. He followed them until they vanished beneath a stand of pines, the ground beyond too churned to offer clarity. Someone had been mapping his movements, probing the same points of vulnerability he had used to slip his messages through. That night, he made the decision he had been postponing since the first carved symbol appeared on the pine trunk. He would no longer rely solely on avoidance. The evidence he had collected had to be moved out of the closed sector in a form that could not be intercepted digitally. It meant another journey beyond the park, another exposure to roads where cameras did not sleep and license plates were logged without human memory to blur the details. He planned the route in silence, tracing it again and again in his mind until it felt like a second anatomy. The departure was executed under the cover of a supply run, paperwork filed with such precision that it bordered on parody. Yet, as he drove past the familiar boundary markers, he sensed a tightening behind him as though the park itself were reluctant to let him go. 2 vehicles joined the road within minutes, keeping their distance just wide enough to deny intent. He did not accelerate. He let them follow, leading them toward a cluster of logging trails that branched unpredictably into the forest. At the last moment, he veered off onto a spur too narrow for their sedans to navigate, disappearing among the trees while the main road curved away into open country. He parked miles from the highway and continued on foot, carrying the most critical of the data in a sealed pouch against his chest. The rendezvous point lay beyond a frozen river, its surface fractured by pressure ridges that sang beneath his boots. On the far bank, he waited, counting his breaths, the silence thick enough to hear his own heartbeat. The agent arrived without ceremony, emerging from the tree line like a shadow given form. There were no greetings, no assurances. The exchange was brief, almost ritualistic, a transfer of weight rather than information. When it was done, the other man vanished as quietly as he had come, leaving behind nothing but a set of footprints that the wind erased within minutes. The return journey was harder. The park greeted him with a storm that had not been in any forecast, snow driven sideways by a wind that seemed to resent his passage. By the time he reached the substation, he was exhausted beyond anything he had felt in years, yet he forced himself to log his arrival, to maintain the facade of routine that was now his only armor. Within 48 hours, the response became unmistakable. He was formally removed from winter patrols in the closed sector, reassigned to perimeter duties pending further evaluation. The order was framed as a precaution, a measure to ensure his safety, but he recognized it for what it was. He was being edged away from the terrain that had allowed him to see too much. He packed his gear that night with deliberate slowness, taking care not to reveal which items mattered most. The closed sector had shaped him, honed his instincts, taught him to read the mountains as both ally and adversary. Now it was being taken from him, and he understood that this was the final act in a long attempt to make the problem go away by removing the witness. As he closed the door to the substation for the last time, he did not look back. The hunt had tightened, yes, but it had also exposed itself. Somewhere beyond the snowbound ridges, the fragments of truth he had carried were converging, assembling into a form that no single authority could easily dismantle. Whatever came next would not unfold in silence, and the closed sector, for all its secrets, would no longer be able to pretend that it was merely another dangerous corner of a beautiful park. The reassignment arrived with the finality of a sealed door. Perimeter duty meant safe roads, predictable routes, a world away from the ravines and hidden ledges that had become his uneasy home. On paper, it was a protective measure, a benevolent decision made in the interest of his health. In practice, it was exile. Yet, exile could not erase what had already been set in motion. The closed sector might have been taken from him, but the evidence he had carried beyond its borders was now moving through channels that no winter storm could silence. He spent his first days on the perimeter performing tasks that felt like echoes of a former life, checking visitor permits, monitoring weather advisories, answering the same questions from tourists who had no idea how close they were to a landscape that had consumed so many unseen lives. The contrast sharpened his sense of urgency. While the park presented its postcard face to the world, the machinery beneath it was finally beginning to grind against its own hidden faults. The first sign that something had changed came not from any official communication, but from the way the roads filled. Vehicles with government plates appeared at odd hours, parking in places that had long stood empty. Surveyors walked stretches of land that had not been surveyed in decades, their instruments cutting clean lines through the snow. Helicopters passed overhead, their rotors shattering the quiet that had once protected the closed sector from scrutiny. No announcements accompanied these movements, but the mountains were no longer allowed to keep their silence. Then the calls began. Old colleagues, people who had once dismissed his unease with practiced indifference, reached out with tentative questions. They had been asked to retrieve archived reports, to account for equipment discrepancies, to justify patrol gaps that had been ignored for years. None of them said his name outright, but he heard it in the spaces between their words, in the careful way they framed each inquiry. The truth, long buried beneath snow and bureaucracy, was being unearthed piece by piece. Within a week, a formal task force was announced, its mandate phrased in the broad language of environmental compliance and historical oversight. He read the notice on a bulletin board in the administrative wing, the ink still sharp, and felt a tremor of recognition. This was the shape of the reckoning he had imagined in sleepless nights, though he had never dared to believe it would arrive so quickly. He was not invited to join the task force. That omission stung more than he expected, but it also confirmed the depth of the system's discomfort with his presence. He remained on the perimeter, watching as the heart of the park was open to inspection by people who had not walked its hidden paths. Yet, he knew, and they would soon learn, that the terrain did not yield its secrets easily. The recovery operations began in earnest as spring threatened to break winter's hold. Teams descended into ravines that had been marked only in his private maps, guided by coordinates that had once existed only in encrypted files. He followed the progress through internal bulletins and whispered conversations, learning which sites had produced evidence, which had revealed nothing but disturbed snow and silence. When the first remains were discovered, the news spread quietly, then with accelerating force. The closed sector was no longer a myth. It was a crime scene. He was present when the first convoy of recovery vehicles rolled past the perimeter checkpoint, their cargo hidden beneath tarps, but their purpose unmistakable. The drivers avoided his eyes, yet one of them paused long enough to offer a nod of acknowledgement that required no explanation. It was the closest he came to public recognition, and he accepted it as such. As more sites were excavated, the narrative began to fracture. Officials who had once spoken with certainty about lost hikers now stumbled through press briefings, their statements hedged with qualifiers. Questions arose about how illegal extraction could have occurred for so long within protected land, about how so many people could vanish without triggering immediate alarm. The answers were slow, contested, layered beneath years of institutional inertia. Yet the snow had begun to release its secrets, and it would not be persuaded to take them back. The arrests came without ceremony. A contractor, whose name had appeared in the drilling ledgers, was detained on his way out of the park. A regional administrator resigned amid allegations of misconduct that traced back further than anyone cared to admit. Each development confirmed what he had known from the moment he lifted the floorboard in the cliffside cabin. This had never been the work of isolated individuals. It was a network sustained by omission as much as by intent. In the evenings, he walked the perimeter roads alone, the world around him thawing inch by inch. Meltwater carved fresh channels through the snowbanks, revealing layers of debris that winter had hidden. He thought of the boot he had uncovered, the strap of a backpack, the ledger entries that reduced human lives to a pair of symbols. Those fragments had found their way into official reports now, transformed into exhibits and case numbers, yet he could not forget their original context, the way they had emerged from the ground like accusations. One afternoon, a journalist approached him at the gate, her recorder already running. She spoke of an anonymous source who had guided investigators to key sites, and to a ranger whose knowledge of the closed sector had proven indispensable. He declined to comment, offering only the scripted assurance that the park was cooperating fully with authorities. She persisted, pressing for a name, a face to attach to the story. He shook his head, aware that some truths lost their power when personalized, when reduced to a single figure who could be celebrated or dismissed at will. The final confirmation came months later, in the form of a quiet email from the federal contact. The task force had completed its initial phase. The network that had exploited the closed sector was dismantled, its operations frozen pending further investigation. More work lay ahead, the message said, but the machinery had been stopped. For now. He read the words twice, then closed his eyes and let the weight of them settle. The mountains beyond the checkpoint were still formidable, still capable of swallowing the unprepared, but they were no longer accomplices to a hidden economy of suffering. The closed sector would not return to its old invisibility. It had been mapped, measured, spoken into existence. On his final patrol of the season, he paused at a viewpoint overlooking the ravines that had once held their secrets so fiercely. Snow still clung to the shaded slopes, but in the sunlight he could see the dark seams of earth where teams had dug, the scars of a reckoning that had come too late for many, yet not too late to matter. He thought of the people whose faces he had memorized from the false passports of the wolves that had watched over an abandoned camp, of the ladder descending into the abyss where no structure should have stood. The park would heal in its own way. Forests always did. But he knew that healing was not the same as forgetting, and he resolved never to allow the closed sector to slip back into comfortable obscurity. In the silence that followed the passing of the last convoy, he stood with the snow melting around his boots and understood, at last, that some places did not hide their crimes. They waited patiently for someone willing to look long enough to see them. If this story kept you on the edge, don't leave yet. Subscribe right now, turn on notifications, and be the first to see the next chapter when it drops. Share this video with someone who loves real stories that go deeper than they seem, and keep this investigation alive by spreading it further.